She fled from her cruel husband to Dash. Then an Apache warrior risked everything to protect her. Eleanor had lived a life that many would describe as one of quiet misery.
4 years she had been married to a man who controlled her every move, crushed her spirit, and made her feel small and insignificant. Her husband Thomas had been charming when they first met. He had swept her off her feet with promises of love and a bright future. But as the years passed, the man she once believed in slowly revealed his true nature. At first, the changes were subtle. He would make small, hurtful comments about her looks, about her cooking, about her choices. Pfft, she brushed them off, thinking it was just stress from his work or maybe the weight of responsibility. But soon, the comments turned into demands. The demands turned into accusations, and the accusations turned into something far worse: abuse. It started with words. His angry rants telling her she wasn't good enough, that she would never amount to anything. He told her she was lucky to have him, that no one else would want a woman like her. Eleanor felt her confidence wither, the bright woman she once was fading into the background of her own life. She began to believe the lies he told her, convinced that she was trapped in a life she could never escape. The worst came when Thomas's temper flared. The first time he hit her, she was in shock. She had never imagined that the man she had married, the man she had once loved, could hurt her in such a way. But as the days passed, the physical violence became just as routine as the emotional cruelty.
"It was always her fault," he would say.
Everything that went wrong in his life was because of her. He would apologize afterward, but the apologies felt empty. Desk. She knew they meant nothing. For years, Eleanor endured it all. She stayed because she thought she had no choice. She stayed because, in some deep part of her, she believed the lies he told her, that she wasn't worthy of anything better.
But something changed inside her.
One night, after a particularly cruel outburst, Eleanor found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her once bright eyes were dull, and her face looked as though it carried the weight of the world. She barely recognized herself anymore. She had spent so much of her life trying to make him happy, trying to please him, that she had forgotten who she was. That night, she made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. Race. She couldn't spend another day in a marriage that drained her of everything: her joy, her strength, and her sense of self. She had to leave. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way she could find a chance at freedom, a chance to rebuild herself. The plan formed slowly. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay in their home any longer. She couldn't risk Thomas finding out her intentions, but she had to leave while he was still asleep. While he was still unaware of what she was planning, she packed a small bag with only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, some money she had hidden over the years, and a small locket that had once belonged to her mother. It wasn't much, but it was all she could carry. As she tiptoed around the house, her heart raced. The house that had once felt like a home now felt like a prison. She could hear the clock ticking in the quiet house, each second stretching into what felt like eternity. Psst. The bed where Thomas lay, oblivious to her actions, seemed like a world away. The thought of leaving him behind, of stepping into the unknown, terrified her. But it was her only option. Eleanor slipped out of the house, careful not to make a sound. The moonlight outside was faint, but enough to guide her as she made her way through the yard, over the fence, and into the dark woods. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. She couldn't look back. With each step she took, Eleanor felt a sense of both fear and exhilaration. Fear of the unknown, fear of being caught, but also a strange sense of freedom. Breath. She had left her old life behind, and there was no going back. She didn't know what awaited her, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had some control over her future. She was choosing her own path. The journey was long and tiring. Bird. Eleanor had to be careful, constantly looking over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't being followed. The world around her seemed vast and endless, the wilderness both beautiful and dangerous. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the sounds of her footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As the hours passed, Eleanor grew tired. She had no destination, no plan, but she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't risk being found. She kept walking, her legs aching, her mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. Could she really escape? Could she survive on her own? The doubts crept in, but she pushed them aside. Breath. She had to keep going. She had no other choice. When the sun began to rise, Eleanor found a small clearing near a creek. Her body was exhausted and she collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily. She had made it through the night. For now, she was safe, but she couldn't let her guard down. She knew her husband's reach was long, and he would stop at nothing to find her. She tried to sleep for a few hours, but it was difficult. The sound of the creek was soothing, but her mind wouldn't allow her to rest fully. She was too afraid, too anxious about what would come next. She had no idea where she was, how far she had traveled, or what dangers lay ahead. But despite all the uncertainty, Eleanor knew one thing. She had made the right choice. Leaving was her only chance to break free from Thomas's control. She couldn't stay in that marriage any longer. She had to live for herself now, even if she didn't know what that meant yet. As the day wore on, Eleanor knew she had to move again. She couldn't stay in one place for too long. She gathered what little strength she had left and made her way deeper into the wilderness.
The journey was just beginning and she had no idea where it would take her. But she was determined to keep moving forward.
The woman who had once been broken by the cruel hands of her husband was now a woman on a mission. A woman who had escaped her past and was ready to forge a new future no matter what it took. Eleanor's journey through the wilderness had only just begun, and the uncertainty of her new life weighed heavily on her. The night she spent by the creek was the first time in years that she had been able to breathe freely. The sound of the water flowing nearby was calming, but it also reminded her of the dangers that still lurked. She had escaped, but there was no guarantee that she would remain free. Thomas would be searching for her, and the wilderness, as vast as it seemed, wasn't as safe as it appeared. When she woke the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky and the cool morning air had begun to warm. Her body was sore from the long walk, but she knew she couldn't afford to rest for long. Eleanor gathered her things quickly, making sure she hadn't left any traces behind that would lead back to her. The creek had been a temporary refuge, but now she had to move on. Her stomach growled with hunger. Narration. She hadn't eaten much the day before, and she knew it was going to be hard to find food in the wilderness. But there was no turning back now. She couldn't return to the life she had just escaped. Her focus sharpened, and her determination grew stronger with every step she took. She had to find a way to survive. The forest around her was dense and untamed. The trees were tall and stretched high into the sky, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and moss, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and earth. It was beautiful, but also isolating. Eleanor couldn't help but feel the weight of the wilderness closing in on her. It felt like she was both part of the forest, and yet, in many ways, completely alone. As the day wore on, she began to feel the strain of her escape. Her legs ached, and her throat was dry. Breath. She had no idea how far she had traveled, or where she was headed. Every direction seemed the same, endless trees and unfamiliar terrain. Eleanor tried to keep a steady pace, but she had to stop several times to catch her breath. She wasn't used to this kind of endurance. The life she had known before had been filled with luxury, comfort, and routines. Now, everything felt foreign. Her mind wandered to the past. She thought about her old life, the house she had grown up in, the way things used to be before Thomas had changed everything. Proud. She remembered the hope she had once felt when she first met him, the dreams they had shared. But all of that seemed like another lifetime now. Her only focus was survival, and even that felt uncertain. Every crack of a branch in the distance made her jump, her heart racing. Was it someone following her? Or just the wind? By mid-afternoon, Eleanor had grown exhausted. She found a small clearing and decided to take a brief rest. Her feet hurt, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She leaned against a tree, trying to steady her breathing. Distance. She closed her eyes for a moment, hoping for a brief reprieve from the overwhelming fear that had been building inside her. It was then that she heard something. The sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Her first instinct was to hide, to find cover. But there was nowhere to run. The trees were thick, but they wouldn't protect her if someone had already seen her. She held her breath, waiting. The footsteps grew louder, and Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. But a man appeared in the clearing, a stranger. He was tall and lean with a rough-hewn appearance. He had a weathered look, as if he had spent years living in the wilderness. His clothes were simple but sturdy, brown leather pants, a worn jacket, and boots covered in dirt. A rifle was slung over his shoulder, and he carried a bag on his side. His eyes were sharp and watchful as he scanned the area. Eleanor froze. Her body tensed, ready to flee at a moment's notice. She didn't know who he was, but she couldn't risk being caught. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Was he a hunter, a tracker sent by Thomas, or just another traveler passing through? The man noticed her, and for a moment their eyes locked. He didn't seem surprised to see her, though. Instead, he studied her carefully, as if weighing his options. His face was hard to read, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her hesitate. There was no anger in his gaze, no threat, but there was caution. He wasn't sure who she was or what she was doing there.
Eleanor stood up, but she didn't move any closer.
She wanted to speak, but her throat felt dry. She had no idea what to say to him, or if saying anything at all was a good idea. The man took a slow step forward, then another. His voice was rough, but it wasn't unkind. "But you're far from home, miss," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had spent too much time alone. "What's your name?"
Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves.
"Eleanor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she should trust him, but she had no choice.
She couldn't keep running forever. The man nodded as if he understood her hesitation.
"You're lucky I came along. The forest isn't kind to people who don't know it well."
"You look like you've been walking a while." I have," Eleanor replied, her voice gaining a little more strength.
"Best. I'm just trying to get away." "From who?" the man asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Eleanor hesitated, bursted. She didn't know if she could trust him with her story, but she couldn't lie either. "From my husband," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been cruel. I had to leave." The man's expression softened, though there was a flicker of something dark in his eyes.
I see. Well, you won't make it on your own for long.
You're welcome to travel with me if you want. I know the land better than most, and it's not safe out here for someone alone. Eleanor looked at him, considering his offer. She didn't know him, and she didn't know if she could trust him, but she also knew that staying alone in the wilderness wasn't a good option either. She had to survive, and having someone who knew the land might give her the best chance. "I'll go with you," she said finally, her voice steady. She didn't have the strength to keep running on her own anymore, and the thought of traveling with someone who might know the way seemed like a lifeline. The man nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Follow me, then," he said, "but be careful. We're not alone out here." As they walked together through the forest, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder what would come next. She had just made a choice that would alter her journey forever, but it was a choice she had to make. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer alone. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know who this man was or where they were headed, but maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who could help her. Eleanor followed the stranger, whose name she still didn't know, through the dense forest. Each step felt like a test of her endurance. She had been walking for hours, and though her legs were sore and her body weary, she couldn't afford to stop now. The man led the way with an ease that suggested he was no stranger to the wild. His movements were purposeful, and he never once glanced back at her. The trees around them stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the quiet of the forest was only interrupted by the occasional bird call or the rustle of leaves underfoot. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something other than fear. The forest was vast, and although it was filled with uncertainty, it also held a strange sense of peace. As they walked, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder about the man who had come to her aid. He hadn't asked too many questions, and he didn't press her for details about her escape. He had simply offered her his help, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to her own anxious mind. She wanted to trust him, but she still didn't know anything about him. Why had he stopped to help her? What did he want in return? They walked in silence, for what seemed like hours. Eleanor could feel the weight of the silence between them, and she knew it was time to break it.
"You've been out here for a while, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity.
The man glanced over at her, his sharp eyes studying her for a moment before he spoke. "A long time," he replied, his voice rough but steady. "This land is my home. I've lived here most of my life." Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't imagine what it would be like to live so far from the life she had known. She had always been surrounded by people, always with the comforts of civilization. Now the wilderness felt like a world apart, both beautiful and dangerous. "I'm grateful for your help," she said, trying to push away the unease that still lingered inside her. "But why are you helping me?" The man didn't answer right away. He seemed to consider her question carefully before responding. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted," he said quietly. "I've been in your shoes before." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She had no idea what he meant, but she could sense there was more to him than met the eye. He wasn't just a traveler passing through. There was something about him, something deeper and more complex. They continued walking, and as the day wore on, Eleanor began to notice more about the man. His clothes were simple, but they looked well-worn and practical. His boots were scuffed and dusty, and the rifle slung across his back seemed like a permanent part of him. His face was weathered, his skin tanned from years of exposure to the sun, and his hair, though dark, had streaks of gray running through it. He moved with a quiet confidence, as if he knew the land better than anyone. Finally, they reached a small clearing. The man paused, scanning the area before he gestured for Eleanor to sit by a small fire pit he had started. The fire crackled as the dry wood caught flame, casting a warm, flickering light on the surrounding trees. Breath. Eleanor lowered herself to the ground, her legs aching from the long walk. The man sat across from her, his eyes never leaving the fire. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Eleanor's thoughts drifted as she stared into the flames. She had no idea where they were or what would happen next. But there was something calming about the steady rhythm of the fire. It made her feel like she was grounded again, even if only for a moment. Desk. After a while, the man spoke, breaking the silence. "You said you were running from your husband!" What happened? Eleanor's heart tightened at the mention of Thomas, as she had not spoken his name aloud in days, and hearing it now brought a rush of memories she had tried so hard to forget. But she couldn't avoid the truth. She had left him because staying meant losing herself completely. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice before she began. "I don't know when things started to go wrong," she said slowly, her voice distant as she relived the memories. "He was never kind, but at first I thought it was just stress, you know. He would get angry, say things that hurt, but I thought it was my fault. I thought I could make it better." The man nodded but didn't interrupt. His gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable. "Then it got worse," Eleanor continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It was the way he looked at me, like I was nothing. I wasn't allowed to make my own decisions, and when I did, he would punish me. He would say I was worthless, that no one else would ever love me. I believed him for a long time. I thought I couldn't survive without him." Her words hung in the air, thick with the weight of what she had endured. The man didn't speak, but she could see the understanding in his eyes. He had been through his own struggles, and somehow she felt like he knew what it was like to be trapped by something far greater than oneself. "But I finally realized," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "that I had to leave." "I couldn't keep living that way. I had to escape. I had to find a way out, no matter what it took." The man was silent for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I've known a lot of people who've had to escape from something. Not all of them make it. But the ones who do are the ones who keep fighting, even when it feels impossible. They keep moving forward." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward him. In that moment, she realized that he wasn't just some stranger offering help. "There!" He understood what it meant to struggle, to survive, and to keep going even when everything seemed lost. He wasn't just protecting her from the dangers of the wilderness. He wasn't protecting her from the past, too. Breath. She smiled faintly, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what will happen next," she said, her voice softer now. "But for the first time, I feel like I might have a chance." The man's eyes met hers, and there was a brief flash of something in his gaze, something that made Eleanor wonder about him, about his past, and what had brought him to this point in his life. But she didn't ask. She wasn't ready to know everything yet. All that mattered was that, for the first time in a long time, she was no longer alone. The fire crackled between them as the night deepened. The wilderness seemed less intimidating now. Eleanor didn't know what the future held, but with each passing moment she felt a little more certain that she could face whatever came her way. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. As the days passed, Eleanor and the man, whose name she had finally learned was Tasanke, began to move deeper into the wilderness. The forest seemed endless, stretching for miles in every direction. Though Eleanor had never thought of herself as a wilderness person, the journey had started to teach her things she never knew about herself. She was learning to survive, to navigate the land, and to trust her instincts in a way she never had before. Tasanke was quiet but kind, guiding her with patience.
He didn't ask too many questions about her life, and Eleanor in turn didn't press him about his.
The way he spoke was measured, his words thoughtful, and he never rushed her to talk more than she was ready. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor felt safe. It wasn't just the protection he provided, but the way he made her feel, like she wasn't just someone to be rescued, but someone worthy of respect and trust. The days blurred into one another, and as they continued their journey, Eleanor found herself looking forward to the quiet moments they shared. They would sit together around the fire at night, talking about small things, about their surroundings, or about simple observations of the world. Sometimes they would sit in silence, just enjoying the peace of the forest and the crackling of the fire. These moments, small as they were, felt like a lifeline to Eleanor, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in the world anymore. They didn't speak about the past often, but when they did, Eleanor would notice the way Tasanke's eyes seemed to darken with something she couldn't quite place.
It wasn't sorrow, but a kind of knowing, as if he understood things that she couldn't yet understand.
There were moments when he would look at her with a quiet intensity, and in those moments, Eleanor wondered what had brought him to this place, what story lay behind the quiet warrior who had chosen to help her. One evening, as they rested near a stream, Eleanor decided to ask. It had been on her mind for days, and though she didn't want to intrude, she couldn't ignore the feeling that there was so much more to Tasanke than he was letting on.
You said you've been here a long time, Eleanor began, watching him closely.
How did you end up in the wilderness? Tasanke didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the fire as if the flames could tell him how much to share. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke.
It's not a simple story, he said, his voice low but steady. My people, my tribe, they have lived here for many generations. But there came a time when the world around us started to change. People began moving into our land, claiming it as their own, changing everything we had known. Eleanor nodded, understanding. Breaths. She knew that many communities had faced struggles like that, families and tribes who had been pushed from their lands, forced to adapt to changes they never asked for. Tasanke continued, his voice tinged with both strength and a quiet sorrow. My people fought, we resisted, but we were outnumbered, outmatched. We lost our land, our way of life.
Many of us had to run, to disappear into places where we could still live with honor. I chose to stay hidden in these woods. I watch, I learn, I survive. Eleanor felt a deep sense of respect for Tasanke, and something inside her softened. She had always thought of the wilderness as something wild and untamable, but she realized now that it wasn't just a place. It was a part of Tasanke's identity. It was where he belonged, where he had found a way to survive despite everything that had happened to him. I didn't ask for this life, Tasanke said quietly, looking up at the stars. But sometimes we don't get to choose our paths.
We are shaped by what happens to us, by the things we can't control, but that doesn't mean we can't still have honor.
Eleanor listened carefully, feeling the weight of his words. She had always believed that the choices we made were what defined us, that the power of decision lay in our hands. But as she sat there beside Tasanke, she understood that sometimes the choices were not our own. Sometimes survival was the only thing we could control.
Do you ever wish things were different? Eleanor asked, her voice tentative.
She wasn't sure if she should push him to answer, but she wanted to understand him more, wanted to know more about the man who had shown her so much kindness. Tasca hesitated before speaking. "Every day," he said, "but wishing doesn't change things. It just keeps you stuck in the past. I've learned that if you want to survive, you have to look ahead. You have to make the most of what you have in the present, because that's all we really have." Eleanor thought about his words for a long time. She had spent so much time looking back at her life, at what she had lost. It was hard to let go of the past, especially when it felt like it had been stolen from her. But Tascance's words resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent too much time worrying about what she couldn't change. Maybe it was time to start focusing on the future, on what she could do now, on what she could still control. For the first time since she had left her old life behind, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose stirring within her. She wasn't just running away anymore. She was moving forward. With every step she took in the wilderness, she was reclaiming a part of herself that she had lost long ago. As the days went on, the bond between Eleanor and Tasca grew stronger. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken, but felt in every moment they shared. They didn't need words to communicate. Their actions said everything. Tassanke showed her how to find food in the wild, how to track animals, how to navigate the forest. And Eleanor, in turn, taught him about the world she had come from, the life she had once known, the things she had left behind. The two of them were like two different worlds colliding, and yet somehow it felt natural. Despite their differences, they found common ground, a shared understanding of survival, of loss, and of finding strength when everything seemed to be falling apart. One afternoon, as they sat by a small stream, their faces lit by the soft sunlight filtering through the trees, Eleanor finally asked him the question that had been lingering in her mind for days. "Do you ever think about returning?" she asked quietly. "To your people?" Tasunke looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. He seemed to be weighing the question carefully, as if considering something long buried inside him. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he said simply. "My people are lost to the world. I don't belong there anymore. Beck, I've found peace here, in the silence of the forest. In my heart, I know that this is where I need to be." Eleanor understood. Sometimes peace didn't come from returning to the past. Sometimes it came from accepting the present, from making a new life where you were, no matter how different it looked from what you had imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fire crackled between them, and Eleanor felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The wilderness wasn't as frightening anymore. With each passing day, she felt herself growing stronger, more confident, and for the first time she didn't feel like a victim of her circumstances. She felt like a survivor. Someone who had fought for her freedom and was beginning to see the possibility of a future she had never imagined. The night was peaceful, the stars shining brightly overhead, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The days seemed to pass in a blur as Eleanor and Tasanka moved through the wilderness, growing closer with each step. They had faced many challenges together, harsh weather, scarce food, and the constant threat of being discovered, but through it all, they had remained a steady team. Eleanor had found strength in herself that she never knew she had, and Tasanke's quiet presence was like a shield that kept her grounded. But despite their growing bond, Eleanor knew the danger wasn't over. Every night as they set camp, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was looking for her. Her escape had been a desperate act, but the reality of her freedom had come with its own set of challenges. She was no longer running from a life she feared, but toward an uncertain future. One evening as they rested beside a small campfire, Eleanor's worst fear was realized. The sounds of footsteps in the distance broke the peaceful silence of the forest. Her heart skipped a beat and her body tensed, instinctively looking to Tusunke. He had been the one constant in her life since she fled, and the thought of losing the safety he provided sent a chill down her spine. Tusunke was already on his feet, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. He didn't say anything, but Eleanor could see the change in him. His calm, unshakable demeanor now replaced with the readiness of a man who knew how to survive. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You need to stay hidden." Eleanor nodded, her breath caught in her chest. She had known this day might come. Her husband's men had been relentless in their pursuit, and no matter how far she ran, it felt like they would never stop. Now, it seemed, they had finally caught up. As Tuske moved silently into the trees, Eleanor hurried to gather what little they had left. She had been prepared for this. In a way, she knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. But even with the knowledge of how dangerous this was, her heart pounded in her chest, and fear threatened to overwhelm her. The men were getting closer, their voices faint but unmistakable. Eleanor's mind raced. She had to stay calm. Tusunke had already taken charge, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had dealt with danger before. She trusted him. But even with his skills, they were outnumbered. It wasn't just a fight for her freedom anymore. It was a fight for her survival, and for the life she was beginning to build. The footsteps grew louder, and soon Eleanor saw shadows moving through the trees. Her husband's men had arrived. They were led by a man she recognized immediately, Samuel, one of Thomas's most loyal men. He was a brute, strong and cruel, and seeing him now sent a wave of dread through her. This was no longer just about escaping her past. This was about facing it head on. "Stay here," Tusunke said firmly, his voice low and commanding. "I'll take care of them." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she knew better than to question him. She had learned by now that Tusunke wasn't just a protector, he was a warrior. And though she feared for his safety, she knew he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. As the men neared, Tusunke melted into the shadows, his movements so fluid that Eleanor barely saw him disappear into the night. She was left alone, her heart hammering in her chest as she crouched low, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. The men came into view, their heavy footsteps crunching on the forest floor. Samuel was at the front, his face twisted in a sneer as he scanned the area, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He was a brute, but there was something sharp in the way he looked around. He knew they were close. "Spread out," Samuel ordered, his voice rough. "She couldn't have gone far. She's here somewhere." Eleanor held her breath, praying they wouldn't find her. Her eyes were locked on the group of men as they moved around the clearing, each one a threat to her new life. She clenched her fists, silently willing them to leave, to give up. But deep down, she knew they wouldn't. Tusunke had taken a position behind them, and he wasn't wasting time. He was quick and efficient, using the cover of darkness to his advantage. One by one, he took down the men who posed a threat, moving silently and swiftly through the forest. Eleanor couldn't see him, but she could hear the struggle. A grunt, the sound of bodies hitting the ground, and then silence. Her heart pounded as she waited, hoping that Tusunke would succeed in his mission. Jobdash could hear Samuel shouting orders, his voice growing more frantic as his men began to fall one by one. The sounds of their struggle grew closer, but Eleanor didn't dare move. She had to stay hidden. She had to trust that Tusunke could handle this. Then the sound stopped. Complete silence enveloped the clearing. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she strained her ears. trying to hear anything, any sign of what had happened. Had Tasanke been caught? Breaths.
Had he? Just as the thought crossed her mind, she heard a soft rustle in the trees, and then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Taskanke, his face grim but unscathed. He moved with the same quiet confidence, but his eyes were full of the intensity of the fight he had just been through.
"They're taken care of," he said softly, his voice steady. "It's safe."
For now. Eleanor's body sagged with relief. She hadn't realized how tightly she had been holding on to her fear until it suddenly melted away.
The danger wasn't over. Not yet, but for the first time since she had left her old life behind, she felt like she could breathe again.
"We need to move," Tasanke continued, his tone urgent.
"They will come back for you, but we have time."
Eleanor nodded, not asking any more questions. She knew he was right. The danger was far from over. But they had survived this encounter, and they would survive the next one. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The two of them moved swiftly through the woods, heading deeper into the forest where they knew the trail would be harder to follow. Eleanor's mind raced as they traveled, but there was a part of her that felt something she hadn't felt in so long: hope.
Despite everything that had happened, despite the fear and the danger, she was still here. She was still fighting.
And for the first time, she realized that maybe she wasn't just surviving. Maybe she was finally starting to live. As the night stretched on and the forest embraced them in its quiet, unyielding beauty, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. And with Tasanke by her side, she would face whatever came next.